amazing questions that I plan to pepper this conversation with. So let's start with one right now.
Yeah.
2 months into 2025, where does the US stand?
これね、3日前。
Very powerful.
新しいでしょ
Powerfully, in the sense that the U.S. economy, of course, is performing considerably better than any of the other G7 economies coming still out of the pandemic. Technologically, only close competitor is China, ahead of the U.S. in some areas, behind the U.S. in other critical areas. But compared to every other country in the world, the U.S. is head and shoulders, neck, waist above them. Militarily, of course, the U.S. is the only country with global ability to project power. No one else is close. And the U.S. dollar is still the global reserve currency. No one is a proximate challenger. And I say all of those things because those are the things that haven't really changed over the course of the last few months. But I suspect that
これね、字幕が出ないとね、何言ってるか分かんないんでね、この人ね、意外とダラダラと長い文章を言うのを初めて気がついた。
isn't what the questioner was asking. What they're really asking is what's happening politically. And politically, the United States is unwinding its own global order. It is no longer particularly interested in promoting collective security or NATO. It's no longer really interested in promoting
彼言ったのは安全保障とかネートにもう関心ないって言ってね。
involvement and leadership of multilateral institutions.
だからマルタイラテラルインスティテューションも関心ないって言って、ね。
Of consistent rule of law.
コンシステントルールオブローも関心ないと。
And free trade that's well regulated.
フリートレードも関心ない。
Certainly not very interested in promoting democracy around the world.
だからプロモーティングデモクラシーアラウンドワールドも関心がないって。
I mean, this is an environment where other countries around the world have to figure out how to adapt to the United States.
だからアメリカにどうやってね合わせていくのかっていうことを世界中の国々は困ってると。
And that the U.S. has become the principal driver of geopolitical risk and uncertainty.
だからアメリカがね、プリンシパルドライバー、ジオポリティカルリスク。
Certainty in the world.
Uncertainty.
Today, unlike any other time in my lifetime and yours.
だからアメリカがどういうふうに動くのかっていうことに対してジオポリティカルで見て世界中がそのアンサーテンティそういうことに関心を持っていると。
That's perhaps the biggest change.
That is
だからそれが世界中のビッグチェンジだって言ってるわけね。
quite a statement. All right, you are a geopolitical expert. Let's talk about Europe. So Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth stated that America's foreign policy focus no longer lies in Europe. Vice President J.D. Vance caused some raised
これJ.D. バンスがさヨーロッパの安全保障サミットで先月彼が演説やったんだよ。
いましたね。ヨーロッパの人から不評でしたよね。
そうそう批判してね。
eyebrows, dropped jaws, and eyes.
だから眉毛をピクピクさせたりドロップ状だから顎が落っこちるようなことを言ったわけだね。
Some choice expletives after his recent speech at the Munich Security Conference.
ドイツのねミューニッヒの安全保障会議でめちゃくちゃ言ったわけですよ、ね。
In which he accused European leaders of suppressing
アキューズだから、めちゃくちゃ言ったと。
free speech and warned of the threat from within. So
だから自由なスピーチの抑圧とかね、それから
So you were in Munich. Was it as dramatic as the stories we read had it? And what happens next?
It was. I was in the room. I was maybe 30 feet away from him.
彼ここにいたんだね。
When he gave that speech, standing right in the front, right next to me was the president of Czechia, the president of Finland, the prime minister of Sweden, watching all of them in their.
すごいね、この人そういう大臣とかそういう首相に混じって座って聞いてたんだね、彼。
reactions. What he said, let's keep in mind, this is the Munich Security Conference. It's been going on now for something like 61 years. And he was the head of the U.S. delegation. And every year, the head of the U.S. delegation gives a big speech on the state of the transatlantic alliance and on global security. And he didn't do that. The people in the audience were expecting a challenging speech.
だからセキュリティの JD バンスはセキュリティのスピーだからアメリカの代表は毎年そのセキュリティのスピーチをするわけだけどね、安全保障の
They were expecting that the
だから
Americans
they were expecting ね
would be less committed to the alignment with the Europeans on Ukraine. The U.S. had just had that direct Trump phone call with Vladimir Putin, 90 minutes long, hadn't
トランプはプーチンと90分の電話会議やったんだね
coordinated that with the Europeans, never mind the Ukrainians in advance. So, I mean, they were definitely
まあヨーロッパの人たちに対してウクライナに関して事前の相談なしでね
prepared for a very challenging plenary. But Vance did none of that. Vance said, I'm not going to talk
だから
about
バーンスは何もそんなこと事前の協議とか相談もしなかった
Ukraine or Russia or China because the biggest problem is actually what's happening inside Europe. The biggest problem essentially
いや最大のバンスが言ったのは最大の問題はヨーロッパ内部の問題だとお前ら何やってんだと
are you guys sitting in front of me that I'm speaking to because you're suppressing
だからさヨーロッパの人の前にしてお前ら何やってんだと問題はヨーロッパ内部の問題だと
free speech. You're
サプレッシングフリースピーチって言ってるから自由な討論を否定してるんだねヨーロッパってね
suppressing the far right. You've been infected.
だからこのウムさんがさ最近開始してるヨーロッパのさ官僚主義って話が出てるじゃないですか。そうヨーロッパも官僚主義が蔓延しちゃって自由な議論ができなくなってきたんじゃないの。
そうそれでさYou are suppressing the far right だから例のドイツのワイデル、第2党になったワイデルそれからあとイタリアのジョルジャ・メローニ、それからフランスのおばちゃん
フランスのおばちゃん誰だ
あれあいつ右翼右派のルペンだからイギリスはファーライトっていたかなイギリスはいたかなまあ要するにドイツ、ワイデルそれからルペンそれジョルジャ・メローニ、ね
did by the woke mind virus and you aren't
ウォークは社会正義が正しいという社会正義を主張する人たち、
だから目覚めた人たちってあれ目覚めた人たちって意味ですよね。
そう
as a consequence.
あなたたちは You are not real democracy.
And specifically, he said, and this is something that I think is underappreciated in the United States, he attacked the German firewall and said that, and let me explain what the German firewall is. That is a principle by the leaders of all of the mainstream German parties and their supporters that they will not under any circumstances work with, enter into coalition with the Alternatives for Deutschland party.
これはドイツのための選択肢 ALD ね
The AFD. Because the AFD, under surveillance from German intelligence agencies, is considered to be a neo-Nazi party. And the
これねこの彼はねイアン・ブレマーはこの AFD を悪く言ってんだけど AFD そのものの僕書いた党のビジョン、全部見たんだけどねまあなんていうかね彼らの特色はね反移民なんでね
そうですよね
でまあナチ的ななんていうかファーライト的な要素は多少あるけどワイデルはそんなことはないって一生懸命言ってんだよね彼女要するに反移民、だから党で第2党までのし上がってきたんだね で特に支持者が多いのは東ドイツ。だからネオナチって世界中騒いでるけどそうでもない。この人はAFD を批判的に見てるからね。
United States, of course, after World War II, led denazification of Germany.
D-Nazi ね。
The day before, Vance had actually gone to Dachau and visited a
彼だからミュンヘンの会議の前にダッハウってコンセントレーションキャンプね、ナチの訪問したんだよね。
concentration camp, and then came to speak in Germany about the firewall needing to be ended. And at that point, someone yelled out from the crowd, "This is unacceptable." And it was right in the front, and people in the room, about 1,500 people in the room, standing room only, couldn't see who it was. They just see the back of his head. I saw who it was. It was the German defense minister, Pistorius. And in 15 years of me going to the Munich Security Conference, I have never seen anything remotely like that. And the reason I mention all of this, and of course, on the back of that, let me be clear, Vance refused to meet with the German chancellor because he's basically, well, he's not relevant. He's only going to be there for a couple more months until a new government, so why should I bother? But does meet with the leader of this AFD, goes and meets with her directly, does a bilateral that evening. So that is a very important backdrop for this last weekend's German elections, where the victor, Friedrich Merz, who is going to be the next chancellor, actually referred specifically to America's intervention in German democracy and support of the
これはあれでアメリカのインターベンションっていうのはイーロン・マスクがね AFD を支援しに行ったんだね。
AFD being every bit as
イーロン・マスクが支援しに行ったんだね。
bad as what the Kremlin is doing inside Germany, and also said that the Europeans need to develop a defense policy which is independent of the United States. In other words, essentially saying that it will be the end of NATO. Again, staggering comments, unheard of, impossible to imagine, even to
これイーロン・マスクはヨーロッパの人間だよね、きっとね。だから NATO を支持してるけど、アメリカは NATO を支持してないよね。
weeks ago, and that's why it's very critical that you have the context of what happened between Vance, Elon Musk over the past couple of months, Trump, with the Germans, with the Europeans, so you can understand why the incoming German chancellor would make a statement like that.
What should we make of all of the conversation about the rise of Nazism, the return of Nazism? Obviously, the AfD just won 20% in the German election. We've also seen people allegedly giving Nazi salutes at various US conventions and speeches. Do you think this is overblown? Is this a fear that people have rationally? And what should we make of that?
In Germany, the Alternatives for Deutschland are winning all of former East Germany. This is a group that increasingly understands that they're never going to really catch up to the rest of Germany. Remember, Germany hasn't really grown in 5 years now. They've been in recession for the last 2. And the average citizen, the average voter living in former East Germany no longer are just angry about not catching up. They're basically saying, I'm done with this system. So that's why you're getting this very strident, revanchist nationalism.
まあ、愛国主義は東ドイツだってね。
That is, that it's not just taking a hard line on illegal immigrants. The AfD even supports removing citizens of Germany that they claim have not adequately integrated into German culture and nationality. And so, I mean, this is some very, very strong stuff that really does feel like what they were doing back in Nazi Germany. But in former East Germany, they win. They get the largest number of votes, where in much of the wealthier part of West Germany, including, where I was in Munich, the AfD can't break out of single digits. So it's a very, very divided country. and also the AfD is doing very.
俺知らなかったよ。ドイツといまだにディバイデドカントリーで東ドイツ、西ドイツの所得格差がひどいって彼は言ってんだよね。で AfD は東ドイツの支持者が多いんだね。
Very, very well among young men. There's a clear gender divide here as well, just as there is in the United States.
だからやっぱり東ドイツの若者に支持がある。で彼はアメリカも一緒だって言ってるね。As there is in the United States ってね。
The U.S. I mean, I of course saw Elon Musk and that, sort of grabbing his heart, saying my heart goes out to you, and then doing what appeared to be mimicking a Nazi salute, and then Steve Bannon doing.
だから結局彼は今イアン・ブレマー言ってるのはアメリカも一緒で、このナチのねこういう動きっていうのはやっぱりそういう貧しい地域が多いと。
The same without the initial heartfelt comment. It clearly was trolling. Clearly was trying to get a reaction from folks. It's very performative, and it's meant to also, attack and attach, make the left lose their minds on something that isn't very critical to what the Trump administration.
これなんかだらだら喋ってるけど、貧しい地域のアメリカ
is trying to do compared to the revolutionary changes inside the U.S. government that they are very much prioritizing.
アメリカっていうのは、いわゆるこうラストベルトの人たちっていう感じなんですかね。
だと思う、そう。それとあと内陸のね。
ラストベルトの支持者、人たちってトランプ支持者が多いよね。
多い。それと内陸の人たちね。だからカリフォルニアとかニューヨークとかアメリカの東海岸の産業地帯はだからそういうトランプ支持者は少ないよね。
民主党が多いよね。
そう。
Now, so I'm very concerned about the rise of neo-Nazism in Germany. I am very much not concerned about that in the U.S. I'm concerned about other things. I'm thinking it is being used as gaslighting for those that can use distractions or can be distracted by them. And I would also say that this election in Germany wasn't surprising. It was exactly as the polls have expected for several months now. But the key elections in Germany and the key elections in Europe are the next cycle. I've spoken with a lot of people around the Trump administration that believe that the Europeans are one electoral cycle behind the United States. So in other words, Trumpism is coming, just not quite yet. And so in the UK, you've got Labour for a full term, but the Reform Party is increasingly the most popular. And just with a little nudge, maybe a little external money, and Elon said he's already thinking about giving them $100 million, which is a massive amount in UK politics, not so much in the US, that the Conservatives would fragment, a rump group would join with Reform, and they could win the next elections. In France, you've had all of these governments continue to collapse. Macron, very unpopular. Marine Le Pen and the National Rally Party could.
今まではそう大してこう右翼は力持ってなかったけど、イギリスとかフランスとかこれからそういう連中が出てくるって言ってんだよね。トランプの影響も受けてね。
Easily win upcoming elections in 2027. In 2029 in Germany, if the Germans are incapable of turning their economy around, incapable of unwinding their debt brake and spending some of the capital that's just sitting there, and as their debt to GDP goes down, but their economy contracts at the same time, then AfD could easily win.
経済が東ドイツはコントラクト縮小して AfD がね。
In 2029, and then the firewall is no more. And then, of course, in the European Union elections overall, in 5 years' time, now 4.5, you could easily see the Patriots front.
愛国主義者ね。だからイアン・ブレマーは今だからイギリスとかフランスとかドイツが急進的な右翼がね力を伸ばしていくと。
Which is the
右翼っていうより愛国主義者だろうね。
Equivalents, the far right grouping.
ファーライトと彼言ってるけどね。
That these parties are a part of they could all come together and be the dominant party, and then the EU as we know it is really a thing of the past. So these are existential changes that are happening, not just for NATO right now, but also for the EU, and quite clear.
だからNATO のためじゃなくて EU
Possibly for the future of democracy as we know it.
All right, let's turn to Ukraine. So President Trump accused President Zelensky of starting the war with Russia and called him a dictator without elections. Last week, senior American and Russian officials met in Riyadh to discuss a potential ceasefire with no Ukrainians present. Now Zelensky has offered to step down in return for Ukrainian admission to NATO, although apparently he doesn't really mean.
これ彼女NATO を認めるためにゼレンスキーが降りるって書いたけど、今はそうじゃないよね。もうトランプは NATO の参加認めてないからね。
So what happens to Ukraine now? What should we be paying attention to?
これだから1週間ぐらい前の話だからね。
Well, I mean, I think he would mean it if NATO membership happened. I'd love to see Trump call his bluff on that, but of course it's not going to. And he wasn't saying that 6 months or
だから NATO の話彼は言ってない。
a year ago. He's saying it now that NATO is truly being pulled off the table. I think it's the right thing for him to do. It is, again, performative and helps to remind those around the world that Ukraine is fighting for self-determination. They're fighting for the ability to join their own alliance, as any country in the world should be able to do. But that is not Trump's belief. Trump
トランプの考えじゃないよね。
is determined by how powerful you are, not that you happen to run a country. And indeed, the territorial integrity is something that is afforded to powerful countries, but not so much for weak countries. And that's the way he feels about Panama, and that's the way he feels about Denmark and Greenland, and that's certainly the way he feels about Ukraine. So right now, as you and I are speaking, the United States is putting forward a new UN resolution at the General Assembly that says that the war has to end as fast as possible, but does not recognize Ukraine's territory.
まあできるだけ早く戦争を終わらせると彼はね、トランプは UN で言ってるけどね。Does not recognize Ukraine territorial
integrity, which has been
領土保全。
a core precept.
中学な問題、領土保全を中学な問題としては捉えていない。
Of the international order that the United States has supported since creating the United Nations and since the end of World War II in 1945. The Americans are now throwing that out. And the Russians, of course, are fully supportive of that. America's allies in Europe are not, but the US has gotten the Saudis to agree, and they're getting a unified Arab bloc. The Americans have privately worked with a lot of poorer countries in Africa, in the Asia Pacific, and others, smaller countries, and saying you're not going to get any aid from the US unless you vote in favor of this new resolution. I fully expect the resolution is going to pass. But of course, what that means is that the Americans are preparing to cut a deal on Ukraine over the heads of the Ukrainians. In other words, the US and Russia together will figure out what a ceasefire should and should not entail as part of a broader US-Russia rapprochement. This is obviously a disaster for the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians who initially refused to accept this so-called deal on Ukrainian natural resources that would grant the Americans 5.
これだから今言ってるトランプが今まで出費した軍備の分はね、のリソースを払って戻せと言ってる。それからウクライナに対して
500 billion in
$500 billion のリソースを
access to such resources in return for paying off aid.
これ金返せって言ってんだけど、ゼレンスキーはね、そんな金返せっていう前提でもらったつもりはないって言ってる。
That the Americans had granted to the Ukrainians without
だからハードグランテッドって言ってんだよね。
conditions or strings, but apparently no longer. And so, what does this all mean? Well, I mean, it means it's yet another case of why people shouldn't trust the United States from one administration to the next, because foreign policy will change completely and what you thought was an American commitment won't stand. It shows that there is a fundamental rift between the Americans and the Europeans, and indeed, Emmanuel Macron in the United States right now, as you and I speak, hoping that he can do something that will keep Trump from, as Macron believes, essentially surrendering to conceding to the Russian position and maintaining some level of coordination with the Europeans, but he doesn't have a lot to offer. And the Ukrainians, now in a position of desperation where maybe they will end up signing over a lot of their natural resources to the Americans, but what, if anything, will they get in return for that? And how empowered will the Russians be in any deal that is cut? And will an independent Ukraine even be able to survive? And what will the terms that will be required of them? Of course, Putin is saying things like no European troops of any sort, whether in a NATO formulation or not, would be allowed as peacekeepers in Ukraine. Well, then how would you guarantee?
ピースキーパーにいくらやね。
What kind of security commitments?
だからギャランティーね。セキュリティコミットメントをトランプはしてないんだよね。
Would you give to the Ukrainians? These are all open questions, but apparently questions that President Trump is prepared to largely resolve on Russia's terms. And again, this is such a dramatic change from where the United States and where the Western order was just a month or two ago.
So let's take some quick-fire questions from our community related to this topic. And I think the first one is particularly pertinent to what you just said. So it's simple. What does Putin have over Trump?
I don't think that
これはプーティンがトランプに対して何を求めてるんだっていう。
Putin has anything over Trump. If he did, then why wouldn't Trump have granted Russia more in his first term? In his first term, he gave the Ukrainians those Javelin anti-tank missiles that
ジャベリンは戦車のための携帯ロケットだよね。
Obama refused to give. And
オバマの時は拒否したんだね。
he thought they were too risky. He increased sanctions against Russia. Now, that was his administration with a lot of hawkish in orientation advisors around him that he doesn't have this time around. They're all directly loyal to him. But I mean, if it was a priority for him, he could have stopped it. And if the Russians had something over him, then why wouldn't they have used it in that case? So it feels like a conspiracy theory. I don't buy it. I think very differently. We can explain what's happening because number one, Trump wants to end wars. It's very popular with his base. He's said this on Gaza. He's said this on Iran, where Israel wants him to support attacks on Iran's nuclear capabilities. And Trump has said no. And he's showing this on Ukraine. He doesn't want to spend money on the Ukrainians going forward.
だからガザもイランもそしてこのウクライナももう金を使いたくないと。
After spending over $100 billion under the last 3 years from the Biden administration, he doesn't want to spend that money going forward. And he also doesn't value a strong Europe. He actually thinks that a weak Europe is in America's interests, where you have more Brexits. He used to always talk to the French about that during his first term. Why won't you do Brexit? He wants all of these MAGA-type populist parties, including the AfD, to win in Europe because that legitimizes his own popularity, just like he loves Milei in Argentina or Bukele in El Salvador. And so I think if you put those things together, you actually get to why Trump is doing what he's doing with the Russians without needing to create a story about Trump somehow being threatened by some secret, shadowy information that the Russians have on Trump that they've let him know about, but nobody else knows. I just don't buy it.
Great. Okay, another community question. If the US hands Ukraine to Russia, will Russia keep going? Will they attempt to take over Europe?
It's interesting that Trump just met with the Polish president, President Duda. It was supposed to be an hour meeting. It was only 10 minutes, so he would kind of embarrass them at home in Poland. But he did say that the U.S. is still committed to maintaining a troop presence on the ground in Poland. And so it's very hard to imagine the Russians rolling through Ukraine and then into Poland, even though there's been lots of asymmetric warfare, for example, and even there have been, Russian missiles launched into Lviv, Ukrainian air defense, missile defense, and with Polish, villagers getting killed because of the fighting. So, I mean, there's been spillover, but America's still going to be in Poland. Why is that? They get along pretty well, and the Poles are heading towards 5% of GDP defense spend this year, which has been the high water mark of American demands of defense spend. So he's been consistent on that over the past months. Baltic states, they're all spending a lot more money on their defense. And so, in principle, you could imagine the United States maintaining these rotational deployments in the Baltics, which would prevent the Russians from invading. But might Trump say, as part of a deal, why do we have all those troops there? You mentioned Pete Hegseth saying the Americans need to get troops out of Europe and get them to Asia, which is where their principal competitive strategy is going to be oriented. And the U.S. hasn't been pressing the Japanese or the Indians, the principal partners, allies in Asia, vis-a-vis China, the way they've been pressing the French, the Brits, the Germans in Europe. So I think it is certainly plausible that the Russians will do more, especially with those countries that refuse to align with a Trump rapprochement towards Russia. The countries I would be most worried about are Moldova, are Georgia. I'd be most worried about the countries that are in the so-called near abroad that aren't a part of NATO and aren't going to become a part of NATO, and therefore are much more vulnerable. But certainly in terms of Russia's willingness to engage in espionage, to fund actors on the ground for arson attacks, assassinations, critical infrastructure attacks on fiber networks, on pipelines, I think all of those things are likely to increase against European states across the board.
だから結局トランプは自分の軍隊の力をアジアに向けていきたい。だからフランスとかイギリスとかやっぱりヨーロッパは彼ら自身で見ていけというようなことを言ってるわけだな。
On the back of this U.S.-Russia rapprochement, yes.
Okay, final community question for this segment. What happens if the US no longer supports NATO?
It's possible that the United States is moving towards a similar posture in Europe that they presently have in Asia, which is strong individual bilateral deals with a number of countries, South Korea, Japan.
バイラテラルディールって彼はトランプは二国間協定を求めてる。
Australia, but not a collective security agreement.
Collective security って集団安全保障。
Where those countries together have more of a call on the United States and there's a lot more free riding. So I could imagine that NATO falls apart and becomes that. The danger
Fall apart ってバラバラになる。
is that even though the Europeans now understand the nature of the threat, that it is very plausible and maybe even baseline that the Americans are going to leave Europe collectively on its own, that seriousness does not equate to the ability to increase spending adequately in the near term. The Germans did manage to pull together a electoral outcome that will allow for a so-called grand coalition, just barely. So you'll have a two-party government in all likelihood instead of a three. But you also have a blocking capacity on the part of the far right and the far left that will prevent the Germans from really
これドイツのファーライトは例の AFD のことね。
blowing out their spending, including their defense spending, unless they can pull something off before that new government is formed, which is possible, but it's unlikely to be very big. The Brits are now talking to about maybe moving the 2.5% of a GDP defense spend over years with a very challenging fiscal environment.
イギリスは 2.5% だね。
The Spaniards not even close, the Italians not even close. So what does a European military capability really look like? And without the Americans, the answer is it's not there. It's not there.
だからアメリカがなかったらもう大変だと。
There. So I think that if NATO falls apart, the reality is that most of Europe will be incredibly vulnerable.
だからそうなってしまうと、ほとんどのヨーロッパはね、インクレディブル、ボルネラブルだっていうんだよね。
External attack, especially Russian attack.
ロシアに対してもう全く無防備だと。
And there won't be a way for them to defend themselves. And some of them will break and therefore want to work more directly and individually with the United States. And that could be the end not only of NATO, but it could be the end of the European Union. I
もう EU が崩壊してしまうくらいの問題だと。
think the stakes are incredibly high. This is an existential challenge.
だからエグジステンシャルチャレンジだからゼレンスキーがトランプと決裂したのはとんでもない話なんだよね。
For European governments that needed to take this seriously 30 years ago, 20 years ago, certainly in 2014 when the Russians invaded Ukraine, certainly
2014年はクリミア半島ね。
in 2016 when Trump was elected, and certainly in 2022 when the Russians then invaded all of Ukraine. And at every point, the Europeans were basically saying, we're still fine with the Americans, basically.
だからね、もうアメリカにくっつくしかない。
And now they are in very serious trouble.
In very serious trouble って言ってんだよ。
Time like the present, I suppose. All right, let's move on. So I mentioned the discussions in Saudi, and obviously also on the agenda there were the discussions about Gaza and Trump's proposal to build a Gaza Riviera. What should we make of that, or as one of our
これリビエラってのはガザをリビエラにするってトランプ言ってんだよね。
community members asked, what is the actual solution for Gaza? And surely it isn't what the US is proposing.
Well, here's what's interesting, that Trump says a lot of things, and when they don't work off, he backs out fairly quickly. And I thought, just stick with Ukraine for 1 second on this. It was interesting to me that Trump has said that he doesn't want to talk to Zelensky because he has no cards, he has no leverage, and so.
だからこれはあなたもビデオ見てるようにゼレンスキーはノーカードだと、ノーレバレッジだって言ってんでね、お前何言ってるんだと。
Why should he let him at the table? And so Trump's going to cut the deal. Very interesting that if that is true, then why is it that the Secretary of Treasury brings this deal and says, you've got to sign this right now, Zelensky, and Zelensky refuses, and then a few days later, the Americans come back with a new deal with altered terms that are not quite as predatory vis-a-vis Ukraine? Why would the Americans change their tune if for someone that has no leverage? Because, I don't think it's because Trump is a nice guy. He's not going soft at 78. I think it's because he overstated how little leverage Ukraine has. Ukraine is very...
だから彼はゼレンスキーとのトランプとの会議を予測してね、ゼレンスキー今回決裂したけど、何を考えてるんだとあいつは。
Very popular among the GOP in the House and Senate, far more than Putin. Zelensky is far more popular in the United States among the voting population than Putin. And of course, he's also much more popular among the Europeans and even globally than Putin. And so it turns out that maybe there is a little bit of leverage that Zelensky has, and maybe Trump does have to give a little bit more. So this is relevant in the context of Gaza, because Trump was very annoyed that, despite his ability to get a ceasefire between Hamas and Israel over the goal line, that his friends in the Middle East were not coming up with a plan for Gaza, where they were supposed to provide security and provide investment and lead reconstruction and deal with the Palestinian populations in the interim. And that wasn't happening. And so Trump, then meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu from Israel in Washington, then after that summoning the Jordanian king, who is the ally that is most reliant on the United States, and so therefore most needing to say yes to whatever Trump's orders of him, basically says, as you mentioned, Helen, that Gaza is going to be a Riviera, that the U.S. is going to turn this into an incredible place. They're going to build wonderful homes for the Palestinians someplace else, and the Palestinians will all volunteer to leave Gaza and go to those homes, and Gaza will be depopulated, and new people will come in and live there. That was the plan. And when he was asked, standing there with King Abdullah from Jordan, under whose authority, Trump's response was, under my authority. And that went over like a lead balloon among America's allies in the Middle East. They all said, we're not up for this. We're not resettling Palestinian populations. They won't actually leave voluntarily. This would actually be a huge problem for Israel's own national security long term. And we're going to come up with another plan. And our plan will keep the Palestinians on the ground in Gaza, at which point Trump pivots to work with the new plan. And his advisors say that Trump was only trying to start the conversation, and what he said was his plan is not actually what he's going to do. So what's sustainable? What would be sustainable would be a lot of Gulf money going in, and maybe some European money too, though they're going to be really pressed given everything you and I just talked about, to try to reconstruct a completely devastated Gaza that eventually some 2 million plus Palestinians will be able to live normal lives in. And the governance will be provided by some technocratic group of a Palestinian authority that will be working with, selected by those that are involved in the reconstruction and the security, namely the Egyptians, the Jordanians, the Saudis, and the Emiratis. That is the best possible deal that they're going to get, but that's happening as Israel has just evacuated forcibly another 40,000 Palestinians from refugee camps in the West Bank, sending tanks in for the first time in decades, and probably precipitating more Israeli settlers taking more land on the ground in the West Bank. And so as we are possibly taking a small step towards a sustainable solution in Gaza, we are taking a slightly larger step away from a sustainable solution for the Palestinians in the West Bank. 'Twas ever thus over the past decades in this incredibly horrible problem and conflict.
And why is Israel?
これ多分ガザの200万人をエジプトのシナイ半島に追い出せて、であそこのガザを誰もいなくして全部再開発して新しい都市を作って、でそこにやっぱりそのアラブの金を依存して都市建設した後は一部のパレスチナ人もそこに受け入れるんだろうな、新しい都市に。でもちろんその工業都市っていうか新しい都市計画で街づくりをするときに前のパレスチナ人の一部をそこに受け入れるような企画をトランプは考えるんだろうな。
でもそれやるとウエストバンクってどうしていくんだろうかっていう。
ウエストバンクはだからこれはまた全く別の問題で。
なんだけど、なんか同じことって起こるんじゃないかと思っちゃうよね。
それはだからトランプも段階を踏んで、PA っていうかね、あそこの自治区についてはまた次の段階でネタニヤフは極右翼なんで次の政権と話をしてどっかで仕切るんだろうね、入植者の制限とか、で独立についてはまだまだ次の先のことでどうやってするかってまだ決めてないんだろうな。ともかく今回のトランプの役割は戦争をやめること、で今のままだったらなぜそのガザそうするかっていうとハマスがいるからね、そういうふうにしてアメリカが管理する土地にしてしまってあそこのパレスチナ人を追い出してしまえばハマスもいなくなっちゃうから、それが狙いなんだよね。だからパレスチナの国を作るっていうのはその後の話で、まずは戦争をやめさせることっていうふうにトランプは考えてるんじゃないかな。ウエストバンクのイスラエル人の入植の件はまた次のステップで考えよう、戦争じゃないから、そういうことだと思うんですよね。
なるほどね。
Doing that? I mean, are they feeling emboldened by the US, or why the incursions in the West Bank now?
Well, I think they're feeling emboldened by their own successes. They have shown that they are the dominant military power in the Middle East, and they have the ability to determine the level of escalation unilaterally, and their adversaries and enemies can't really do any damage to them. They proved that after October 7th in their response to Hamas. They proved that in decapitating and taking out the military capabilities of Hezbollah. And they've proved that also with overturning, they didn't do it, but the fact that the Assad regime in Syria is gone, which means that the Iranians no longer have a land bridge to get additional weapons to what had been the strongest adversary of Israel militarily, Hezbollah. So all of that has shown that Israel can decide outcomes. They're the ones that have all the power here. And also that depopulation of Gaza is very popular among Israelis. There was a poll recently in the Jerusalem Post, which is pretty mainstream in Israel. 80% of Israeli respondents said that they wanted to depopulate Gaza of all Palestinians. Taking more land is very popular, especially in the West Bank, especially among Netanyahu's present right-wing coalition that he would like to keep together to continue to govern. And this is a sop to them as he is looking to potentially extend the ceasefire in Gaza and move from phase 1 to phase 2, which is facing some delays and open questions right now. So yes, certainly the United States has been underpinning that military capability of Israel. And I think it is instructive to remember that not only does the U.S. provide more military aid peacetime to any country in the world, to Israel, but that unlike in Ukraine, where the Trump administration is saying, no, I'm not happy with the grants, you've got to pay that back, the billions and billions that the United States sends to Israel, nobody is suggesting that that should be alone, or that the Americans should get technology rights or mineral rights or anything else from Israel, despite the fact that Trump's policy is America first. Israel is a very clear exception to America first in Trump's visioning of it.
All right, so we talked about the fact that the foreign policy focus of America is shifting to Asia. So what are you hearing about how China is feeling in all of this, and what should we be paying attention to on that front?
China has had a couple good weeks economically, and specifically on the back of that huge announcement of DeepSeek, which has far less money behind it than the comparable American chatbots, but is performing at an extremely high level. And given the fact that there are all of these export controls on semiconductors and other parts of advanced technology.
話が中国移ってきて今日ここで終わるけど、ここで終わる。